Harold, before we actually get started in the committee meeting, workshop, I'm going to do something real personal. And while I'm out here in Washington, I'm missing the 19th birthday of my little kid today. So happy birthday, Hannah, if you see it on the broadcast, which you won't. I also missed the 17th birthday of my youngest child, which was 2 days ago. So happy birthday, Mary. And thank you for indulging me in that little bit.
Okay. All right, Alan, why don't you start? Shirley,
I should wish happy birthday.
There we go. Thank you. I've missed them the last 3 years by being in USCF meetings, so it's kind of become a tradition. The last year, at the annual meeting of the delegates, the governance task force brought to the floor, and brought to this workshop and then to the floor, a series of motions designed to accommodate making the executive board of directors of the USCF Federation. The arguments for that were presented at length last year, primarily the fact that that's really largely how we do business today, with a few exceptions that we are covering in the proposed changes to make sure that we codify those exceptions, and to streamline the administration of the USCF Federation. Problems associated with the delegates being the directors. The directors have certain legal liabilities, can be sued in ways that volunteers cannot be, we have a problem from an organizational standpoint that we frequently do not know who the directors of the organization are. We have delegates who don't realize that they are directors with a fiduciary responsibility to the organization, and I dare say we have some delegates who prefer not to be directors of the organization. So this was this.
Delegates who don't even think they're delegates or know they're delegates.
We have delegates who don't know they're delegates. I think that has happened in the past as well, and it may be still happening. So last year this came to the floor with the idea that it would be a couple-year process. We would bring it here, bring it to this meeting last year out in California, discuss it in detail. I'm sorry, in Orlando, the meetings are merged together. Discuss it in detail and bring back ideas and then work to make those ideas function. Last year, what was referred to the Bylaws Committee was DM 1118. It's on page 16 of your delegate's call. And in going through that, these incorporated the thoughts and ideas of the delegates and the workshop participants last year. We took that, took a look at it, and went about trying to make the vision of the delegates from last year a reality. Now, what we did to do that is get in touch with our Illinois Nonprofit Corporate Council. Because anytime we're going to start changing bylaws that change the duties of people, that allocate out different responsibilities, we want to do it in a way that will be legal under Illinois law. And rather than guess at it with a bunch of people who are very intelligent but are not well versed in Illinois nonprofit law, it seemed the prudent course of action to spend a little bit of money with our Illinois attorney, and that is what we did. And in the process of doing that, we looked at, it became very clear last year that the delegates wished to remain in control of certain processes and responsibilities of the organization. Most of those things are fine. Last year, in the referred DM 1118, we had control of the bylaws and the rules of chess, to approve the budget, supervise the ethics compliance process. All of those things are possible. One thing that is in the DM 1118, which is not possible under Illinois law, is for the delegates to have the authority to amend the Articles of Incorporation. There are only two bodies under Illinois law that can amend the Articles of Incorporation legally. One of those is the Board of Directors of the organization. So if the EB is the Board of Directors, they could amend the Articles of Incorporation. However, the other provision under Illinois law is for the voting members to amend the Articles of Incorporation. It seemed that the most consistent approach with the desires of the delegates from last year was to include a provision for the voting members to be the ones who could amend the Articles of Incorporation. That is consistent with Illinois law, and that is what the committee proposals, which are contained in the next series of items, provide for. In fact, that particular item is in ADM 1214 and 1215, which are on page 19 of your delegates card. Amendments to the Articles of Incorporation that are proposed by the Executive Board, because they would be proposed by the Board of Directors, must be approved by the vote of the voting members, and the voting procedure will be as provided for in the bylaws. Right now, our votes in the bylaws provide for a majority of those voting members who vote, and that is in accordance with Illinois corporate law. We cannot reduce that number below a majority. By action of, we could increase it to a 2/3 majority, but we cannot reduce it below a majority. So that is one thing that's different, and then in discussions in the committee we've added a different change to that. But I'm just pointing that out right now. From the referred BDM, the delegates cannot retain control of the Articles of Incorporation because it's just not permitted under Illinois law if they're not either the directors or the whole body of the voting members. So we looked at making that the voting members. Now, I have handed out to you that everything else basically is the same. If you look at BM 1118, we're proposing no changes in paragraph 3. We're taking paragraph 1 out because we're going to deal with that in a little different way. Paragraph 3, which says the USCF, any delegate has the right to access official monthly financial reports, that's staying in there. If you go down below to paragraph 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, remaining items are consistent with the above changes. The amendment to Article 9, Section 12. Existing Article 9, Section 12 provides indemnification for the directors of the organization. If the delegates are no longer directors, this amendment adds them to the indemnification for acts taken at delegates' meetings. The same thing with Article 9, Section 13 and Article 9, Section 14. If those simply add the word delegates to the existing bylaw provisions, since the existing bylaw provisions provide for directors, which currently encompasses the delegates. Okay? So by and large, we changed very little about what the delegates sent to us last year. And here's what we did change. Under Illinois law, Harold had noted this last year, but we did not have a solution for it until we went back to the attorney and had a fairly lengthy series of discussions. In all honesty, I spent about $4,000 of your money to have these discussions with the attorney over the course of about 3 months or so. But that seemed to be prudent to make sure that we did this right in a way that could not be challenged. In the discussion with the attorney, the note that Harold had noted is that committees, to be able to bind the organization contractually, under Illinois law, and indeed under the law in most every state, because it's in the Uniform Nonprofit Corporation Statute, there were questions of why don't we move the incorporation to another state? Isn't going to solve this problem. In the Uniform Nonprofit Statute, the only people who can contractually obligate a nonprofit organization are its board of directors. They're the only people who can sign contracts. Now, that board of directors can devolve that responsibility onto a very select group of people. It can allow that authority to be given to officers of the corporation, which is why the executive director can execute contracts on behalf of the corporation. It can devolve that authority onto committees of the board. A committee of the board must be comprised of a majority of members of the board. So if you had a 5-person committee, at least 3 must be members of the board. So we have various committees that are appointed by the delegates. Right now, that's not a huge problem because the delegates are the board of directors. So we went back and we looked at every committee that is appointed within the organization. Many of the committees that the delegates appoint don't bind the organization. The audit committee, for example, does not bind the organization. It recommends the hiring of a certified public accounting firm to do the audit. It receives certain reports. It has communications with the auditors, but the actual people who hire the auditor are the executive board. That's why the executive board can function, because it's comprised of 7 directors. So now, our other committees that have some sort of decision-making authority, we looked at those. Ethics and TVCC jump to mind, in that those 2 committees make certain rulings. However, if you look at the process which is which the delegates have established for those committees to function, all of the decisions of both of those committees currently flow through the executive board in some form or fashion. They are either appealable to the executive board. In many cases, the executive board currently can take up those cases even without an appeal. So those decisions do not technically bind the USCF until a period has passed which allows the executive board to do something with it. And there is an appeal process then that comes back through the board of the organization. So we don't have a problem with those. The LMA is a different. So there was one other committee, Harold, and I don't remember which one it was right off the top of my head. Elections. Elections has a special carve-out under Illinois law. Okay, so the Elections Committee under Illinois nonprofit law has the ability to operate independently of the organization, and of the board of directors, which obviously it would have to. So they have a carve-out, and we don't have an issue with the Elections Committee. We talked about ethics, talked about PDCC. The Life and Asset Committee, however, is a serious problem when we change the structure around. Because the Life and Asset Committee has the authority currently to contractually obligate the organization. Every time it buys and sells an investment, it's executing a contract. And that will not work. The current structure of the LMA will not work, of it being appointed by the delegates to manage those assets if the executive board is the directors. Okay? Because it would have to have the authority to buy and sell. It would have to be appointed by the executive board and have a majority of the members beyond the executive. That did not seem to be consistent with the desires of the delegates as outlined in DM 1118. So we spent a considerable amount of time, the attorney and I, figuring out how to solve this problem. And the solution, we explored a couple of different ideas on the telephone. One would be you could actually set up a separate 501c3 foundation or something. The problem with that is that organization could kind of go off on its own. And we didn't think that was in keeping with the desires of the delegates either. So the best way that we came up with to solve the problem was through the use of trust. The trust idea, what a trust is it's a legal entity that that holds assets for another. The person for whom it holds assets is called the beneficiary. And a trust can have one beneficiary or multiple beneficiaries. In our case, the beneficiary of the trust would be the U.S. Chess Federation. And the assets of the trust could only be handled to benefit the U.S. Chess Federation. Okay? So it can't go off somewhere else and do something else. The trustees have no authority to get money out of that to anybody other than the U.S. Chess Federation. The maker of the trust would be the U.S. Chess Federation. So the way the dynamics of it work is the delegates, before we take up any idea about changing who the board of directors are, the delegates, as the board of directors, would authorize the making of this trust. And we would transfer into it the assets that are currently being held and managed by the Life Member Asset Committee. Through the terms of the trust and through an amendment to the Articles of Incorporation, which presently could still be done by the delegates. Remember, the directors can do it unless in your Articles of Incorporation it reserves that right to the voting members. We haven't changed that yet. So the delegates mechanically would make the trust, move the stuff into it, and direct the amendment of the Articles of Incorporation to allow themselves to appoint and remove the trustees. And the delegates could appoint whichever trustees they want, with the exception of one. The trust calls for 11 trustees. The delegates appoint 10 of them. And the 11th one is the Vice President Finance of the U.S. Chess Federation. That's consistent with the current structure of the LMA. The VP Finance of the USCF is a sitting member of the LMA, and the delegates appoint the rest of the committee members. So we simply took the existing structure and put it into there. Now the problem right now, what we had to do in the trust is define the number of trustees. So we fixed it at 11 because that's what the current body is. Okay, so we have the same numbers what we presently have. I think the numbers on the LMA have fluctuated some over the years, but presently it's 11, so we're making the number 11. We give the trust the ability to own real estate because presently the building is in the hands of the LMA. We give the trust the ability to buy and sell assets. Now, the original proposal, as printed in your delegates call on page 17 and 18 as ADM 12-9, also contains a provision that makes this trust irrevocable and unamendable, meaning that once it's established, it could never, ever be changed, absent the action of a court. And courts don't change trust provisions unless they are egregious and contrary to law, and there's nothing in here that a court would ever change, frankly. So the reason for that is there are two basic types of trusts. There is an irrevocable trust, and there is a grantor trust. The difference is, in a grantor trust, the people who set it up have the power to revoke it, just to make it go away like it didn't exist. That's the difference between the two. However, that simple difference has a profound effect on a couple of things. taxation being the primary one, and access to the assets being the second. An irrevocable trust is a separate taxable entity. And it is a taxable entity. You do not get around the trust being a taxable entity. And I'm going to get CPA arcane on you for a minute, and I apologize. A taxable trust, depending on the trust terms, can be simple or complex. This would be a complex trust because the trustees would not be obligated to send all of the earnings to the USCF every year. The trustees would be obligated to continue to make the payments in support of the life member, to support the life memberships, as had been agreed in Cherry Hill, and for new memberships going forward. Okay? So if the trust earned more than that, they don't pay that over just by matter of the operation of the trust. Any amounts that the trustees, under an irrevocable trust, any amounts that the trustees pay to the USCF would not be taxed in the trust. And the USCF is a tax-exempt organization, so there's no tax. But if we had investment earnings in the trust that exceed the amounts paid to the USCF in any particular year, the trust would be subject to tax. Let me finish this one thought, Cheryl. Now, the reason why you might do that is in an irrevocable trust, the assets are completely protected from the creditors of the making of the grantor. So if the USCF got sued and lost a lawsuit for $1 bajillion, the trust assets could not be attached because it's a separate legal entity. They could attach the revenue stream coming out of the trust every year, but they could not attach the assets that are in there. Okay? So that's the irrevocable trust. The toll charge is the tax. That's the con. The pro is the legal legal protection of the assets from creditors. Gerald?
For instance, will we have a tax liability this year in the LMA?
I don't know because I don't know what the current LMA investment earnings are. I suspect not. No. I suspect not. Now, so that's one way to do it, and that's the way that it's outlined in 12-09. Now, we had some members who raised the possibility of doing it a different way. Still with a trust, but with a grantor trust, where the people who make the trust could revoke it. What that does for you, a grantor trust from a tax standpoint is a non-entity. It doesn't even file a tax return. And the beneficiary picks up all of the income on its tax return. And we still have to file a tax return, even as a tax exempt. So there's never the possibility of having a tax by operation of the trust. There's something called unrelated business income tax, and if you really want to discuss that, I'll be more than happy to hold a session in the hallway later, but you really probably don't want to know that. And so the positive of the grantor trust is that we resolve the tax question. The con of the grantor trust is that assets in a grantor trust remain subject to claims of the creditors of the organization, of the grantor, which would be USCF. So that's the pro and con of the two approaches. And that's the primary difference. We would have to file a tax return for the trust if it were irrevocable and potentially pay tax over there. We would lose flexibility. You know, whatever was set up was set up. We couldn't change it. So after kicking that around, and kicking it around in the Bylaws Committee and dinner the other night, we came up with, and having some extensive discussions with the attorney on Wednesday morning from out here. We came up with some alternative language, which you have, which in your handout, and those changes are bolded to make this a grantor trust instead and remove the tax issue, allow us the flexibility of changing it in the future, but at the same time that would return those, it would leave the assets subject to the creditors of the organization just like they are now. So that would be the change. Now, so that's the first change that you see on the handout, where we strike out item number 2, which says the trust shall be irrevocable and unamendable. Okay. And then item number 3, hold on a second, provides for how it would be revoked. And it would be revoked, could be revoked by the Board of Delegates by a 2/3 vote of the delegates present at an annual special meeting, provided that a proposal to revoke is included in the advance agenda. They're all in the back. They're on the back table by Savant.
Harold, bring me one too.
Sure.
So that provides for the revocation. Now there are a couple of other things that you changed to provide for the revocation. If you flip that handout over to the top of page 3. Yes? I'm going to come back to that. I'm just dealing with the revocation issue right now. We add that same language into the bylaws. So we make the bylaws provision so that everybody knows that what ADM 12.9 is the provisions of the trust. We also add that revocation authority into the bylaws, which we're doing in section Article 9, Section 10, which is the sundry bylaws. We replace some language about the LMA borrowing, which will not be relevant anymore, because it will be contained within the terms of the trust. We also have to then adjust the articles of incorporation, which is in your other handout. Under ADM 12.14 and 12.15, where it says to establish or revoke one or more trusts. If we were just going to do an irrevocable trust, we would give the trustees, the Board of Delegates, rather just the authority to establish it. Okay? Ken, you had a hand up.
Yes, I wanted to ask a question about the protections afforded by the irrevocable trust. Taking a hypothetical situation, or at least I hope it's truly hypothetical, that if we were to have an irrevocable trust, and if the USCF were to be sued, as you say, for $1 bazillion, and we lose the suit so that all of our assets are attached, but what's in this trust is protected, well, that presumably leaves USCF with pretty much nothing but what's in the trust.
Correct.
My question is, if the USCF, or if if the USCF were then to receive assets transferred out of that trust, or say as they usually are every year, some portion transferred to operations, do those assets then lose their protection and are subject to being attached just as any other assets would be?
Yes.
So basically the assets in the irrevocable trust would only be protected as long as they sit behind that firewall.
Right.
So we could be broken sitting there and staring at that cash and thinking that would sure help and we're not getting it.
Absolutely. Yes, Simone.
But in that situation, if that happened and we got sued for $1 bajillion, the organization would just fold, and we would take those funds and transfer it to our successor, and those funds would not be then touchable by the creditors, correct?
Let's. I'm going to answer your question in a little bit of a roundabout way. The short answer is yes. Let's look at provision. It's in here. It's in here. Provision. I'm sorry. 4. Under provision 4, I hit it right at the beginning. Upon dissolution of the USCF. So if the U.S. Chess Federation ever dissolved, ever went away, for whatever reason, the trust would be dissolved by function of its own terms. And the assets would go in the same place